Welcome to our channel, where tonight, we step into the shadowy corridors of abandoned asylums and uncover the chilling stories that have left even the bravest trembling. From eerie whispers to ghostly apparitions, these haunted mental hospitals hold secrets of torment, tragedy, and the supernatural. Turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. These are true horror stories from the world's most haunted asylums. Story number 1. The Shadows of Gonjiam. They say that Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital is cursed, a place so dark and twisted that even the bravest souls leave trembling. I didn't believe it, at least, not at first. It was just another story, another legend for thrill seekers and ghost hunters. But when my friend Jihoon dared me to join him on a visit to the abandoned asylum, I learned the truth the hard way. Gonjiam isn't just haunted, it's alive, and it's waiting for anyone foolish enough to step inside. The hospital loomed ahead of us as we parked at the edge of the woods. Even in the fading light of day, the building was imposing, its cracked facade covered in vines and grime. The windows were dark, gaping holes that seemed to stare back at us. Jihoon was grinning, his camera slung over his shoulder, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. "Come on," he said, tugging at my sleeve. "It's just an old building." But it wasn't just an old building. I could feel it even before we stepped inside. A presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't see. We found an open door near the back of the building, its hinges rusted and groaning as we pushed it open. The air inside was colder, damp and heavy with the smell of mildew and something metallic. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow hallway ahead of us. The walls were streaked with graffiti and grime, and broken furniture was scattered across the floor. "Let's start on the first floor," Jihoon said, his voice too loud in the oppressive silence. "We can work our way up." I nodded, though my legs already felt like lead. The first floor was unsettling but uneventful. Empty rooms, peeling wallpaper, and rusted medical equipment were all that remained of what must have once been a bustling hospital. Jihoon was in his element, snapping photos and narrating the history of the place as though we were on some kind of guided tour. But then we reached the stairwell. The air grew colder as we climbed, the darkness deeper, as though the light from our flashlights couldn't reach as far. I thought I heard something, a faint shuffle, like footsteps coming from above, but every time I stopped to listen, the sound vanished. When we reached the second floor, Jihoon paused, his camera pointed toward the hallway ahead. "This is where the real activity happens," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "People say you can hear voices, screams, even see shadows." I didn't respond. I was too focused on the strange feeling creeping up my spine, a sensation of being watched. We moved cautiously through the second floor, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Most of the rooms were empty, but some still held remnants of the past. A broken wheelchair, a child's drawing taped to the wall, a bed with its straps still attached. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step, the air colder, until I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. That's when we heard it. A scream, faint at first, but growing louder, more desperate, echoing through the hallway. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jihoon nodded, his face pale. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his voice wavered. But it wasn't the wind. We followed the sound, though every instinct told me to turn back. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows at the edges of my vision shifting and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The scream stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. "Leave." My chest tightened, and I grabbed Jihoon's arm. "We need to go." He hesitated, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Just a little farther," he said, moving toward the source of the sound. The whisper led us to a room at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar. Jihoon pushed it open, revealing a small, empty space. The walls were bare, except for one, a single word scrawled in red paint. Or maybe blood. Stay. We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. My flashlight flickered, and in the corner of the room, I saw them, shadows, dozens of them, their shapes shifting and writhing, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved toward us, their whispers growing louder, filling my head until I thought I might scream. Jehoon was frozen, his camera clutched in his trembling hands. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "Run," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. We stumbled into the hallway, the shadows following close behind. The whispers turned into screams, echoing off the walls, and I could feel something cold and heavy brushing against my back, like hands reaching for me. The stairwell was just ahead, but it felt miles away. By the time we reached the first floor, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. The shadows didn't follow us outside, but the screams lingered, growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the building. We didn't speak as we ran back to the car. Jehoon's hands were shaking so badly, he could barely unlock the doors. When we finally drove away, I glanced back at the hospital, and for a split second, I saw something standing in one of the windows, a dark figure. His glowing eyes locked onto mine. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget it. Jehoon hasn't spoken about what happened, and he refuses to look at the photos he took. As for me, I've stopped visiting abandoned places, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, as though they're calling me back. If you ever think about visiting Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital, don't. It's not just a building, it's something darker, something that feeds on the fear of those who dare to enter. And if you're not careful, you might not make it out. Story number 2. The Whispers of Denby. There are places where the past doesn't just linger, it clings. Denby Asylum, nestled deep in the Welsh countryside, is one of those places. I'd heard the stories, like everyone else, of tortured patients, cruel treatments, and the screams that supposedly still echo through the crumbling halls. I never thought I'd see it for myself, but when my best friend, Owen, invited me to Wales for a ghost hunt, couldn't resist. It wasn't that I believed in ghosts, I didn't, but there was something about the idea of stepping into a place so steeped in darkness, so infamous, that intrigued me. It was curiosity, plain and simple. I should have known better. Denby looked like something out of a nightmare. The asylum loomed against the gray Welsh sky, its once grand facade now crumbling and covered in ivy. The windows were shattered, gaping holes that stared back at us like dead eyes. The surrounding fields were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel exposed. "This is amazing," Owen said, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Can you imagine the history in this place?" I nodded, but a chill crept up my spine as I stared at the building. Felt wrong, like the air around it was heavier, thicker. Let's just get this over with. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in a long, dimly lit hallway. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the sharp scent of mildew and rot. Our footsteps echoed loudly against the cracked tiles, the sound far too loud for the oppressive silence. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and old, rusted medical equipment lay scattered across the floor. Wheelchairs, gurneys, and cabinets sat untouched, like relics of a forgotten time. Owen was thrilled, snapping photos and pointing out details I wanted to ignore. "This is gold," he said, grinning. "Can you imagine the stories these walls could tell?" "I'd rather not," I muttered. The deeper we ventured, the colder it got. It wasn't just the chill of the air. It was a bone-deep cold, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your breath fog in front of you. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, the creak of a door, the scuffle of footsteps. But when I turned, there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Owen replied. distracted by a dusty old wheelchair he was photographing. "Never mind," I said, though my stomach churned. When we reached the second floor, the atmosphere changed. The silence was no longer empty, it was oppressive, like the building was holding its breath. The hallways stretched out before us, narrow and endless, their shadows deeper and darker than they should have been. "This is where the lobotomies happened," Owen said, his voice low with a mix of awe and unease. "And the electroshock therapy. They say the patient's screams could be heard all the way in the village." I didn't respond. My attention was fixed on the shadows at the end of the hallway. They seemed to shift and writhe, like they were alive. "Let's keep moving." We entered a room that must have been a treatment area. The walls were lined with rusted cabinets, and in the center of the room stood a single metal chair, the straps frayed but still intact. The air here was thicker, heavier, and I could feel my chest tighten with every breath. "This is incredible," Owen whispered, his camera clicking as he took photo after photo. "It's like stepping back in time." But I wasn't looking at the chair. I was looking at the wall behind it, where faint scratches marred the surface. As I stepped closer, I realized they weren't random, they were words, carved deep into the plaster. "They watch." A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned to Owen. "We need to go." He frowned. "What are you talking about? We just got here." "I'm serious," I said, my voice shaking. "This place isn't right." As we argued, the door creaked shut behind us. The sound echoed through the room, louder than it should have been. Owen froze, his eyes wide. "Did you do that?" "No," I said, my heart pounding. Before either of us could move, the whispers started, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, but growing louder and more distinct. They weren't just voices, they were pleading, desperate, overlapping in a cacophony of sound. "Help me. Don't leave. They're here." The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure on my chest, like something was squeezing the air out of my lungs. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and shift, forming shapes that moved toward us. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing Owen's arm, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the chair, where a figure now sat. It was a man, or what was left of one. His body was thin, emaciated, and his face was a twisted mask of pain. His eyes were wide and empty, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. Slowly, he turned his head to look at us. Owen stumbled backward, his camera clattering to the floor. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the figure disappeared, leaving the chair empty once more. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, angrier, until they felt like they were coming from inside my head. "Run," I said, pulling Owen toward the door. We sprinted down the hallway, the shadows chasing us, their shapes twisting and writhing like living things. The whispers turned into screams, echoing off the walls, and I could feel something cold and heavy brushing against my back. When we reached the stairwell, Owen tripped, his flashlight rolling away into the darkness. I turned to help him, but he was staring at something behind me, his face pale and frozen with terror. "She's there," he whispered. I didn't look, couldn't. I grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet, and we ran. By the time we made it outside, the night air felt sharp and clean, like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. But the relief was short-lived. As we reached the car, I turned to look back at the asylum. Figures stood in the windows, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. And at the center, standing just inside the doorway, was the man from the chair. He raised a hand, as if waving goodbye, and then he was gone. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget it. Owen refuses to talk about what happened, and he won't show anyone the photos he took. As for me, I hear the whispers sometimes, soft and insistent, as if they're calling me back. And every now and then, I see her, the shadow at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. They say Denby is haunted, that the souls of the patients still linger there, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured. I believe it, I saw them, and I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you ever think about visiting, don't. Some places are better left forgotten, and some whispers should never be answered. Story number 3. The Haunting of Beechworth Lunatic Asylum. They say Beechworth Lunatic Asylum is one of the most haunted places in Australia. That alone should have been enough to keep me away. But when my cousin Ben insisted on visiting, I let curiosity get the better of me. I told myself it was just another abandoned building, just another set of stories to scare tourists. I was wrong. Beechworth wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted us to know it. We arrived at the asylum just before sunset. The building loomed ahead of us, a massive structure of crumbling brick and shattered windows, its shadow stretching across the overgrown grounds. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. Even before we got out of the car, I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. "This is incredible," Ben said, grinning as he grabbed his camera. "Can you believe this place has been abandoned for decades?" Could. Every crack, every rusted hinge, every shadow seemed to scream of abandonment. But there was something else too, something beneath the surface. Like the building was holding its breath, waiting. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, scraps of paper too faded to read. The air inside was colder, sharper, and it carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Ben was already snapping photos, his excitement undimmed by the eerie surroundings. "Look at this place," he said, his voice echoing faintly. "It's like a time capsule." I didn't respond. I was too focused on the shadows at the edges of my flashlight beam, the way they seemed to shift and move, just out of reach. We started in the main building, moving through what used to be patient rooms and common areas. Most were empty, their contents long since stripped away, but some still held remnants of the past: a rusted bed frame, a child's toy, a chair with straps hanging loosely from its arms. It was in one of these rooms that I felt it for the first time, the cold touch of something brushing against my arm. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. But when I turned, there was nothing there. "Ben," I whispered, "did you feel that?" He glanced at me, frowning. "Feel what?" I didn't answer. There was no point. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. As we moved deeper into the building, the atmosphere grew heavier, darker. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, as though the walls were absorbing every sound we made. And then, faintly, I heard it. A laugh, high-pitched and childlike, echoing faintly down the hallway. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ben nodded, his grin fading. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The laugh came again, louder this time, and it wasn't alone. Footsteps followed, light and quick, as if someone or something was running just out of sight. We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, until we reached a large, open room. This was the children's ward, Ben told me. The walls were painted with faded murals of animals and flowers, and the floor was littered with toys left to rot. It was here that we saw her. She was standing in the corner, a little girl no older than 7, wearing a white dress that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her hair was dark and tangled, and her face was pale, almost translucent. She was staring at us, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her mouth curved into a small, innocent smile. "Hi there," Ben said softly, taking a step toward her. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, watching us, her head tilted slightly to the side. And then, without a sound, she turned and ran, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. "Wait," Ben called, rushing after her. "Ben, don't," I shouted, but he was already gone, disappearing down the hallway after the girl. I followed as quickly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The shadows grew darker, denser, and the air grew colder with every step. "Ben," I called, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then I heard him scream. The sound led me to a large room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the switch, my hands shaking, and when the light finally came back on, I saw him. Ben was lying on the floor, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Standing over him was a man in a white coat, his features sharp and angular, his eyes cold and unfeeling. His hands were covered in blood, and he held a rusted scalpel that gleamed faintly in the light. "Get away from him," I shouted, but the man didn't move. He just stared at me, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile, and then he vanished. Ben was alive, but barely. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, his body trembling uncontrollably. I dragged him out of the room and down the hallway, the laughter following us, echoing off the walls like a taunt. The shadows grew closer, reaching for us, and I felt the cold touch of hands brushing against my skin. By the time we made it outside, Ben was unconscious, and I was barely holding it together. I loaded him into the car and drove away as fast as I could, the asylum disappearing into the darkness behind us. Ben recovered physically, but he was never the same. He doesn't talk about what happened, and neither do I, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that laugh again, faint and distant, as if it's calling me back. They say Beechworth is haunted, that the souls of the dead still linger there, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured. I believe it. I saw it. I felt it. And I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you ever think about visiting Beechworth Lunatic Asylum, don't. It's not just a place. It's a wound, festering with the memories of the lives it destroyed. And some wounds never heal. Story number 4. The Forgotten of Penhist. There are some places that carry their scars on the surface, and others where the pain runs so deep it's woven into the walls. Penhist Asylum is one of the latter. The stories of what happened there, of children locked in cages, patients beaten and starved, are enough to make your skin crawl. But I didn't need to hear the stories. I experienced it for myself. I didn't want to go there. My girlfriend, Mia, thought it would be fun. One of those Halloween night excursions that promise cheap thrills and jump scares. "It's just a tour," she said, laughing. "What's the worst that could happen?" I should have said no. I should have trusted the feeling in my gut that told me Penhist was more than just an abandoned asylum. The building loomed ahead of us as we pulled into the parking lot. Its massive, crumbling facade was bathed in the pale glow of the moon, and even from the car, I could feel its presence, a heavy, oppressive weight that made the air feel colder. The trees around the property were skeletal, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. "This is going to be so cool," Mia said, her excitement undimmed by the eerie surroundings. I forced a smile, trying to shake the unease that was already settling in my chest. We joined the group at the main entrance, where our guide, a wiry man with a flashlight and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, welcomed us with a brief history of the asylum. He talked about the overcrowding, the abuse, the lawsuits that finally shut the place down. But as he spoke, I found my gaze drifting to the darkened windows above, where I could have sworn I saw movement. "It's just shadows," I told myself, but the chill in my bones said otherwise. The tour started in the main building, a labyrinth of narrow hallways and empty rooms. Most of the spaces had been stripped bare, but some still held remnants of the past. A broken wheelchair, a rusted bed frame, a child's drawing taped to the wall. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something sharper, metallic. Our guide led us through the corridors, pointing out hotspots for paranormal activity. "This is the children's ward," he said, gesturing to a row of small, windowless rooms. "People say they hear laughter here, or see shadows darting across the walls. As if on cue, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle coming from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mia. She nodded, her face pale. "It sounded like a kid." The guide smiled, clearly pleased. "That happens a lot. Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The deeper we went into the asylum, the worse it got. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of something darting into a room. A shape standing at the edge of the flashlight's beam. Gone before I could focus on it. Then there were the sounds. Footsteps echoing in the halls behind us. Whispers just on the edge of hearing. Soft and insistent. I felt a hand brush against my arm. Cold and light. But when I turned, there was no one there. "This is creepy," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should head back." But the guide was already leading us toward the basement. The basement was worse than anything I'd imagined. The walls were lined with pipes that dripped water onto the cracked, stained floor. The air was thicker here, harder to breathe, and carried a stench that made my stomach churn. The guide stopped at a large metal door, his flashlight illuminating a rusted latch. "This is where they kept the worst cases," he said. "Patients who were considered dangerous or simply unwanted. Many of them never came back up." As he spoke, the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my chest tightened with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. "Let's move on," Mia said, her voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, the door creaked open. The room beyond was massive, its walls covered in strange, childlike drawings etched into the stone. Chains hung from the ceiling, their metal rusted and stained. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, its legs bolted to the floor, the straps on its arms frayed but intact. And then we saw him. He was standing in the corner, a small boy no older than 6, dressed in tattered clothes that looked decades out of place. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and dark, staring at us with an intensity that made my chest tighten. He smiled, a small, innocent smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hello," Mia said softly, taking a step toward him. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on us, unblinking, and then, without a sound, he turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't wait for the guide. Mia and I bolted back up the stairs, the whispers and footsteps following us. The air grew colder with every step, and I could feel something behind us, something cold and dark, reaching out. By the time we reached the main hall, my legs felt like lead, and my lungs burned with every breath. When we finally burst outside, the night air felt sharp and clean, like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. But the sense of relief was fleeting, because as we turned to look back at the asylum, we saw them, figures standing in the windows, their shapes dark and twisted, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. And at the center, standing just inside the doorway, was the boy. He raised a hand, as if waving goodbye, and then they were gone. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget it. Mia doesn't talk about what happened, and she refuses to go anywhere near Penhist again. As for me, I hear the whispers sometimes, soft and insistent, as if they're calling me back. And every now and then, I see him, the boy, standing at the edge of my vision, his dark eyes watching. They say Penhist is haunted, that the souls of the patients still linger there, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured. I believe it. I saw them. I felt them, and I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you ever think about visiting, don't. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. Some laughter is better left unheard. Story number 5. The Lost Children of Letchworth. There's something about abandoned places that draws people in. Maybe it's the mystery, or the promise of a brush with the unknown. For me, It was neither. I didn't want to go to Letchworth Village, but my best friend, Sarah, wouldn't stop talking about it. They say you can hear kids laughing, she said one night, her eyes alight with excitement. Sometimes you even see them playing in the fields. Doesn't that sound amazing? I didn't think it sounded amazing. It sounded tragic. Letchworth wasn't just an old hospital. It was a place of suffering, a crumbling monument to neglect and abuse. But Sarah was relentless, and eventually, I gave in. I told myself it was just a building, just another ghost story. Couldn't have been more wrong. We arrived just before sundown. The sprawling complex was hidden deep in the woods, its crumbling facades partially swallowed by overgrowth. The air was thick and humid, the faint scent of mildew and decay hanging heavy. Even before we stepped out of the car, I felt it, a weight, pressure, as if the air itself was warning us to turn back. Sarah didn't seem to notice. "This place is incredible," she said, grabbing her flashlight and camera. "Come on, let's check out the children's ward." The children's ward. Just hearing the words made my stomach churn. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, scraps of paper too faded to read. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating glimpses of the building's former life. A rusted wheelchair tipped on its side, a child's drawing taped to the wall, its colors faded to pale smudges. "This is so creepy," Sarah whispered, her voice bouncing off the walls. "Isn't it great?" I didn't respond. My attention was on the far end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, like something was moving just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. "Did you see that?" I asked. "See what?" "Never mind." The deeper we went, the colder it got. The air was heavy, damp, and carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint giggle, the soft patter of footsteps, but every time I stopped to listen, the sounds vanished. "It's probably just animals," Sarah said, but even she sounded less certain as we reached the children's playroom. The room was large, its walls painted with faded murals of animals and balloons. The floor was covered in broken toys, dolls missing limbs, toy cars with their wheels snapped off, a stuffed bear so worn it was barely recognizable. My flashlight caught a child's rocking horse in the corner, its paint peeling, its seat stained with something dark. Sarah knelt to pick up a doll, its porcelain face cracked and its dress tattered. "Imagine the stories this place could tell," she said, her voice tinged with awe. I didn't want to imagine. I just wanted to leave. That's when we heard it. Laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing faintly down the hallway. Sarah froze, the doll slipping from her hands. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat tight. The laughter was soft at first, but it grew louder, bouncing off the walls until it felt like it was coming from every direction. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the room, a small figure darting into the shadows. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped. We stood there, frozen, as the silence pressed down on us. And then, faintly, we heard it again, footsteps, light, quick, running down the hallway outside. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and bolted after the sound. "Wait!" I shouted, but she was already gone. I chased after her, my heart pounding as the laughter started up again, louder and more distorted. It wasn't just children anymore. There were other voices now, low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Sarah," I called, my voice echoing down the hallway. I found her in one of the dormitory rooms, staring at the far corner. Her flashlight illuminated a row of small beds, their metal frames rusted and their mattresses rotting. At the foot of one bed sat a small figure, a boy, no older than 6. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and almost translucent, and his eyes were dark, bottomless pits. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, taking a hesitant step forward. The boy didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at us, his head tilted slightly to the side. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the far wall. I turned my flashlight toward it and froze. The wall was covered in scratches, deep gouges that spelled out words, "Help us." The boy was gone when I turned back. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale. "We need to leave," she whispered. Couldn't have agreed more. We stumbled through the halls, the laughter and whispers following us. The shadows seemed to close in, twisting and writhing along the walls. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and when I turned, I saw them, children, their hollow eyes watching us from the darkness. By the time we made it outside, the sun had set, and the forest was bathed in shadows. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Sarah was shaking as she fumbled with the keys, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of the children standing in the doorway. We drove away in silence, the weight of what we'd seen settling over us like a shroud. But as we turned onto the main road, I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw them. They were standing at the edge of the woods, a group of children watching us leave. And at the center was the boy, his dark eyes locked onto mine. It's been months since that night, but I can't forget it. Sarah won't talk about what happened, and she refuses to look at the photos she took. As for me, I hear the laughter sometimes, soft and distant, as if it's calling me back. And every now and then, I see him, the boy, standing just at the edge of my vision, his hollow eyes following me. They say Letchworth is haunted, that the souls of the children who suffered there still linger, trapped by the pain they endured. I believe it. I saw them, and I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you're ever tempted to visit, don't. Some places are better left forgotten, and some laughter should never be heard. Story number 6. The Haunting of Waverly Hills. They call it one of the most haunted places in America, a monument to suffering and death. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands like a scar on the Kentucky hills, its decaying walls echoing with the cries of the thousands who died there. I'd heard the stories growing up, the ghostly figures that drifted through its halls, the screams from room 502, the ominous death tunnel where bodies were sent to avoid alarming the living. I never wanted to see it for myself, but some mistakes can't be undone. Started as a dare. My friends, Alex and Jamie, thought it would be fun to explore Waverly Hills on Halloween night. "Come on," Alex said, his grin wide and daring. "It's just an old building. You don't believe in that ghost crap, do you?" I wanted to say no. Every instinct told me not to go. But pride's a funny thing, and I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. So I agreed. We packed flashlights, cameras, and a bottle of cheap whiskey for courage, and headed out into the night. The sanatorium loomed ahead of us, its Gothic architecture silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Even from the parking lot, I could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. The air was colder here, the wind carrying whispers I couldn't quite make out. Jamie shivered. "This place gives me the creeps." Alex laughed, his bravado unwavering. "That's the point. Let's go." We found a gap in the fence and made our way inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic, like old blood. The main hallway stretched out before us, its walls cracked and covered in graffiti. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of debris under our boots. "This is awesome," Alex said, shining his flashlight down the corridor. "Creepy as hell." Jamie didn't respond. She was looking down one of the side halls, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Alex asked. She hesitated. It sounded like footsteps. We decided to start on the first floor, moving slowly through the empty rooms. Most were stripped bare, their windows shattered, their floors littered with debris. But every so often, we'd find something that didn't belong. A child's toy lying in the middle of the hallway, a single shoe tucked into a corner, a wheelchair that seemed to have been left in a hurry. "Creepy," Alex muttered, taking a swig from the whiskey bottle. As we moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the walls, too fast to be real. I told myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't. When we reached the second floor, the atmosphere changed. The air was heavier, thicker, and the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with something else, whispers, faint and indistinct, just on the edge of hearing. "What's up there?" Jamie asked, her voice trembling. "Room 502, Alex said, grinning. "That's where the nurse killed herself, right?" "Two nurses," I corrected, my voice barely above a whisper. "One hung herself, and the other jumped out the window." Jamie shuddered. "Let's not go up there." But Alex was already heading toward the stairs. The stairwell was narrow and dark, the steps slick with moss and water. By the time we reached the 5th floor, my heart was pounding, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. The hallway stretched out before us, its walls lined with empty door frames. At the far end, I could see the outline of room 502. Alex walked ahead, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. "Come on, don't wimp out now." Jamie and I followed reluctantly, the weight in the air growing heavier with each step. When we reached the door, Alex pushed it open, revealing a small, empty room with a single window. The air inside was freezing, colder than the rest of the building, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "This is it," Alex said, stepping inside. The room felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. The shadows seemed darker here, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. As Alex moved toward the window, Jamie grabbed my arm. "Do you feel that?" I nodded. It wasn't just cold, it was oppressive, like the room was alive and angry. Suddenly, Alex's flashlight flickered, and we heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My chest tightened as the voice grew louder, overlapping with others until it became a cacophony of sound. "Did you hear that?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. Before we could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and desperate, like 100 voices crying out in pain. Shadows darted across the walls, their shapes twisted and unnatural. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and when I turned, I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her head tilted downward, her body swaying slightly. Her hair was matted, her white nurse's uniform stained with something dark. Slowly, she lifted her head, and her eyes locked onto mine. They were empty, hollow, filled with a rage that didn't feel human. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "We have to get out of here." Alex was frozen, staring at her in disbelief. Jamie grabbed his arm, screaming, "Move!" We bolted down the hallway, the screams echoing behind us. The shadows followed, twisting and writhing along the walls, and I swear I could feel them reaching for me. When we reached the stairs, Alex tripped, his flashlight clattering to the floor. I turned to help him, but he was staring up at something behind me, his face pale. "She's here," he whispered. I didn't look, couldn't. I grabbed his arm and dragged him to his feet, and we ran. By the time we made it outside, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. The cold night air was sharp against my skin, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. We didn't speak on the drive home. Alex didn't touch the whiskey, and Jamie wouldn't stop shaking. When we finally pulled into my driveway, Alex turned to me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget it. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, like they're calling me back. And every now and then, I see her in my dreams, standing in the corner of the room, her empty eyes staring into mine. They say Waverly Hills is haunted, that the souls of the dead still linger there, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured. But I think it's more than that. I think the building itself is alive, feeding on the fear of anyone foolish enough to enter. If you ever find yourself near Waverly Hills, do yourself a favor, stay away. Some doors should never be opened, and some shadows can't be escaped. Story number 7. The Whispers of Trans-Allegheny. They say some places never let go of the past, and Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is one of them. I'd heard the stories about the overcrowding, the screams of the tortured patients, the doctors who experimented on the helpless, and the spirits that still wander its halls. But nothing prepares you for standing there, staring up at the massive stone structure as it looms over you like a judgment. My friend Eric convinced me to visit. "It's just an old building," he said. "And besides, what's the worst that could happen? A ghost says boo." I should have trusted my instincts and stayed home. But Eric was relentless, and so I found myself stepping into one of the darkest corners of American history. We arrived at sunset. The building stood like a fortress against the horizon, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The air was still, heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. Even before we stepped inside, I felt it, the oppressive weight of something unseen. Watching, Eric grinned, slinging his camera bag over his shoulder. "This is going to be awesome." I didn't respond. My stomach was already churning, my pulse quickening with every step. The first thing that struck me as we entered was the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like the building itself was holding its breath. The grand hall stretched before us, its walls cracked and covered in graffiti, the floor littered with debris. Eric's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the outlines of old furniture and rusted medical equipment. "This place is insane," he whispered, as if the walls themselves might hear him. We started with the first floor, moving cautiously through the empty hallways. Most of the rooms were stripped bare, their contents long since looted or rotted away, but some still held remnants of the past. A broken wheelchair, a child's doll missing an eye, an old bed frame with its straps still intact. The air grew colder as we walked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It started with the whispers. First, I thought it was Eric muttering to himself, but when I asked him, he shook his head. "I didn't say anything," he said, his voice tight. We both stood still, listening. The sound was faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone speaking from far away. The words were indistinct, but the tone was pleading, desperate, sent a chill down my spine. "Maybe it's the wind," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. But there was no wind. The whispers led us to the second floor, where the air grew colder, the shadows darker. This was where the worst of the experiments had taken place, the lobotomies, the electroshock treatments, the so-called therapies that left patients broken in body and mind. The walls here seemed to hold onto the pain, the echoes of screams that had long since faded. "Let's check out the operating theater," Eric said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. I didn't want to, but I followed him. The room was just as horrifying as I'd imagined. Rusted surgical tools scattered across a table, a gurney tipped on its side, the floor stained with something dark. The air was thick, heavy, and I could feel my chest tighten as I stepped inside. That's when the crying started. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, their sobs filling the room until it felt like the walls were closing in. I looked at Eric, but he was frozen, his camera clutched tightly in his hands. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah." Before I could say anything else, the door slammed shut. The crying stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, I saw them. They were standing in the corner of the room, figures dressed in hospital gowns, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air itself was pressing down on me. "Eric," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to go." But he didn't respond. He was staring at something behind me, his face frozen in terror. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw her. She was sitting on the gurney, her body hunched over, her hair matted and tangled. She wore a hospital gown stained with blood, and her hands were clutching at her head. Slowly, she lifted her face to look at me, and I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were dark, empty voids, and her mouth twisted into a scream that I couldn't hear but felt in my chest. I stumbled backward, grabbing Eric's arm. "Run," I whispered. We bolted out of the room, the door slamming behind us. The whispers followed, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, reaching for us as we ran down the hallway. When we reached the stairwell, Eric tripped, his camera clattering to the floor. I turned to help him, but he was staring up at the landing above us, his face pale. "She's there," he whispered. I didn't look, couldn't. I grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet, and we ran. By the time we made it outside, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. The night air was cold and sharp, but it felt like freedom. We didn't stop until we reached the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. We didn't speak on the drive home. Eric wouldn't even look at me, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. When we finally reached my house, he turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did we see in there?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget it. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her face, those hollow eyes, that silent scream, and every now and then, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, as if they're calling me back. They say Trans-Allegheny is haunted, that the souls of the patients still linger there, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured. I believe it. I saw it. I felt it. And I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you ever think about visiting, don't. Some places are meant to be forgotten. Some whispers are meant to be left unanswered. Story number 8. The shadows beneath Taunton. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories about haunted places, creaking floorboards, cold spots, the usual, but I always figured it was just overactive imaginations. Then I visited Taunton State Hospital. I didn't go there for thrills. My friend Rachel dragged me along. She was obsessed with abandoned places, always hunting for the next creepy site to explore. When she found out about Taunton, she wouldn't let it go. "It's legendary," she said, her eyes lighting up. "People say they see shadows, feel like they're being watched. There's even a secret basement where they did rituals." I should have said no. I should have stayed home, but curiosity got the better of me. The hospital was massive, its Victorian-style architecture looming against the darkening sky. The windows were dark, empty sockets staring back at us, and the overgrown grounds seemed to creep toward the building like clawing fingers. Even before we stepped inside, I felt it, a weight pressing down on my chest, as if the building itself was alive. Rachel was unfazed, grinning as she pulled out her flashlight. "This is going to be amazing." I wasn't so sure. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in a long, narrow hallway. The air inside was cold, damp, and carried a faint metallic scent that made my stomach churn. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, broken furniture, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "This place is a gold mine," Rachel said, snapping pictures with her phone. But I could barely focus. There was something about the silence, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting, We started with the upper floors, exploring what used to be patient rooms. Most were empty, but some still held eerie remnants of the past. A rusted bed frame, a child's toy lying in a corner, a chair with leather straps hanging loosely from its arms. As we moved deeper into the hospital, the air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then we heard it. First, it was faint, like distant whispers. I stopped, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Rachel paused, frowning. "Hear what?" "Voices," I said. "It sounded like someone talking." She shrugged. "It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder as we made our way to the lower levels, morphing into something more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. By the time we reached the basement stairs, I was ready to leave. Rachel, of course, wasn't. "We have to check it out," she said, her excitement undimmed. "This is where the rituals happened." I hesitated, staring down the dark stairwell. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, acrid smell that made my eyes water. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but Rachel was already descending, her flashlight bobbing in the darkness. The basement was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, and the floor was slick with something I didn't want to identify. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I could feel my chest tighten with every breath. "This is incredible," Rachel whispered, her flashlight sweeping across the room. The space was filled with strange symbols carved into the walls, their edges darkened as if burned. In the center of the room was a large stone slab, its surface stained with dark, rusty streaks. "This is where they did it," Rachel said, her voice tinged with awe. "The rituals." I didn't want to know what kind of rituals she meant. As Rachel explored, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift and writhe, and I thought I saw movement just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. "Rachel," I said, my voice trembling, "we need to leave." She didn't respond. She was staring at something on the far wall, her flashlight illuminating a small, dark alcove. "What is that?" she whispered, stepping closer. I followed reluctantly, my heart pounding. Inside the alcove was a small, rusted door, its surface covered in scratches. The air here was colder, sharper, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my skin. Rachel reached for the handle. "Don't," I said, grabbing her arm. "We need to go, now." But it was too late. She pulled the door open. The screams hit us like a wave. They were high-pitched, desperate, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand, as the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. "Do you see that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. At first, I didn't, but then my eyes adjusted, and I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their forms twisted and indistinct. They moved toward us, their bodies writhing as if trapped in some invisible torment. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Rachel's arm, but she was frozen, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the stone slab. "There's someone on it," she whispered. I turned, and my blood ran cold. A figure lay on the slab, his body pale and emaciated, his chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths, turned its head toward us, its eyes meeting mine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Help me," it whispered, its voice barely audible over the screams. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I pulled Rachel toward the stairs, the shadows closing in around us as we ran. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, until they seemed to echo inside my head. By the time we reached the car, I could barely breathe. Rachel was pale, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. We didn't speak as we drove away, the hospital disappearing into the darkness behind us. It's been months since that night, but I can't forget it. Rachel won't talk about what happened, and she refuses to look at the photos she took. As for me, I haven't been able to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, as if they're calling me back. They say Taunton is haunted, that the spirits of the patients and the victims of the rituals still linger there. I believe it. I saw them, and I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you're ever tempted to visit Taunton State Hospital, don't. Some places are meant to stay buried, and some shadows should never be disturbed. Story number 9. The Headless Shadows of Sai Ing-pun. I wasn't supposed to be in Hong Kong that long. It was meant to be a quick trip, 3 days for business, a little sightseeing, then back home to the States. But when my meeting got canceled, my local contact, Michael, suggested I stick around for a few extra days and see the city. It was his idea to visit Sai Ing-pun. "You like spooky stuff, right?" he asked, grinning. "You've got to check this place out. It's the real deal headless ghosts. Screams in the middle of the night. Total nightmare fuel." I should have said no. I should have stuck to the crowded markets and neon-lit streets. But Michael had that infectious enthusiasm that made it hard to back out. So, on my last night in Hong Kong, we made our way to the crumbling remains of the Sai Ing-pun Psychiatric Hospital. The building stood like a ghost itself, shrouded in shadows at the edge of a quiet residential neighborhood. Its facade was cracked and weathered, ivy creeping up its stone walls. The air around it was still and heavy, as if the place were holding its breath. Even before we stepped through the rusted gates, I felt it, the weight of something unseen pressing down on my chest. "This place was a hospital for years," Michael said, his voice low. "But during the Japanese occupation, it became something else. People say they tortured prisoners here, executed them. Some say you can still hear the screams." I forced a laugh. "Sounds charming. You're gonna love it," he said, already leading the way inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, mildew, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. The air inside was colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, broken furniture, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "This is where it gets creepy," Michael said, pointing to a staircase that spiraled down into the basement. "That's where they say the executions happened." I hesitated, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "You've been down there before?" "Once," he said, his grin faltering. "Didn't stay long. Too many bad vibes." "Then why are we doing this?" He shrugged. "Because it's awesome." The basement was worse than I imagined. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, and the floor was slick with something that made my boots stick with every step. The air was heavier here, and the silence wasn't just oppressive. It was alive. I could feel it pressing against my ears, making my pulse thrum louder in my head. Michael was ahead of me, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. "They used to hang prisoners down here," he said, "or behead them. Depends on who you ask." "Great," I muttered. As we moved deeper, I started to hear it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps echoing in the distance. First, I thought it was just the creak of the old building settling, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Michael stopped, turning to me. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," I said. "They're coming from..." Before I could finish, the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was the scrape of something dragging along the floor, slow and deliberate. "Okay, maybe this isn't such a great idea," Michael said, backing toward me. "No kidding." We turned to head back, but the hallway behind us seemed longer, darker than it had been before. The shadows at the edges of our flashlight beams twisted and writhed, and the air grew colder with every step. "Keep moving," Michael said, his voice tight. That's when we saw it. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, A figure dressed in what looked like tattered military clothes. Its body was thin, skeletal, and its arms hung limply at its sides. But it wasn't the body that made my stomach drop. It was the lack of a head. The figure moved toward us, slow and deliberate, the sound of dragging metal growing louder with each step. I felt my legs lock in place, my body frozen with terror. "Run," Michael whispered, grabbing my arm. "Run." We bolted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps and dragging metal echoing behind us. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with us, closing in like a wave of darkness. My lungs burned, and my chest tightened with every breath. But I didn't stop. When we reached the staircase, I stumbled, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. Michael turned back, his face pale. "Get up!" I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and scrambled to my feet. As I turned to look back, I saw them, not just one, but dozens of figures, their bodies shrouded in shadows, their heads missing. They moved toward us in unison, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. My chest heaved, my heart pounding in my ears as I collapsed onto the cracked pavement. Michael was beside me, his hands on his knees, his face slick with sweat. Neither of us spoke as we stumbled back to the car. The silence between us was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. When we finally drove away, I glanced back at the building one last time. They were standing in the windows, a line of headless figures watching us leave. And at the center was the first one we'd seen, his body still, his presence looming. It's been months since that night, but I can't forget it. Michael doesn't talk about what happened, and he refuses to answer my calls. As for me, I hear the footsteps sometimes, soft, rhythmic, dragging when I'm alone in the dark. And every now and then, I see a shadow at the edge of my vision, standing perfectly still. They say Sai Ingpun is haunted, that the spirits of the tortured and executed still linger there, trapped by the violence and pain they endured. I believe it. I saw them, and I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you're ever tempted to visit, don't. Some places aren't just haunted, they're cursed, and Sai Ingpun is one of them. Story number 10. The Wailing Walls of Byberry. They say Byberry Mental Hospital is cursed. A sprawling, decaying labyrinth just outside Philadelphia. It was built to help the sick but became a place of suffering. Patients were crammed into overcrowded rooms, forgotten in their filth, and left to rot. Stories of abuse, neglect, and even murder are as much a part of its foundation as the bricks and mortar. When the state shut it down in 1990, people thought the darkness would leave with the last patient. But the stories didn't stop. I didn't want to go there, but my brother Jake had other ideas. He'd been obsessed with urban exploration for years, dragging me into crumbling factories and deserted train stations. But Byberry was different. "This place is legendary," he said, his eyes lighting up. "They say you can hear screams echoing through the halls. Even now. You up for it?" I wasn't, but I wasn't about to let him go alone. We arrived just before sunset. The hospital loomed ahead of us, its crumbling towers silhouetted against the fading light. The windows were shattered, gaping holes that stared back like the hollow eyes of a skull. The air was thick and still, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rot. Even from the parking lot, I could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on my chest, heavy and suffocating. "Let's go," Jake said, already heading toward a gap in the rusted chain link fence. His excitement was infectious, but I couldn't shake the unease curling in my stomach. The moment we stepped inside, the air grew colder. The hallways stretched out before us, dark and endless, their walls covered in graffiti and grime. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of debris under our boots. Jake swept his flashlight across the room, illuminating broken furniture and rusted gurneys. "This place is incredible," he whispered. I wasn't so sure. The first few floors were exactly what I'd expected: empty rooms, peeling paint, and the occasional remnant of its grim history. A rusted wheelchair tipped over in a corner, a patient's file left to rot in a pile of debris. But the deeper we went, the darker it became. It wasn't just the absence of light. The shadows here felt alive, twisting and shifting at the edges of my vision. Then we heard it, a scream, faint at first, distant, but unmistakable. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Did you hear that?" Jake grinned, though his voice was tight. "It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. We followed the sound, our footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles. The screams grew louder, more desperate, until they seemed to fill the hallway. They weren't just random cries, they were voices, pleading, begging, overlapping in a cacophony of anguish. "Help me! Don't leave me! They're coming!" Jake's grin faltered, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. "This is crazy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go back," I said, my chest tightening with every step. But Jake was already moving forward, drawn toward the source of the sound. The hallway ended at a large, rusted door, its surface covered in scratches. Jake pushed it open, revealing a sprawling room that must have once been a common area. The walls were lined with broken furniture, the floor covered in scattered debris. In the center of the room stood a single metal bed frame, the straps frayed but intact. And then we saw them. They were shadows at first, shifting and writhing at the edges of the room. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they weren't just shadows. They were figures, gaunt, hollow-eyed shapes dressed in tattered hospital gowns. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Jake stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the figures turned toward us. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted into silent screams. We ran. The hallway stretched endlessly before us, the shadows chasing us, their whispers growing louder. The air grew colder with every step, the weight of the building pressing down on us like a living thing. I could feel something behind me, this cold breath brushing against my neck. By the time we reached the stairwell, my legs felt like lead, and my lungs burned with every breath. Jake tripped, his flashlight clattering to the ground, and I turned to help him. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the top of the stairs, a young woman in a tattered hospital gown. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. Slowly, she raised a hand, pointing at me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. I grabbed Jake, pulling him to his feet, and we bolted down the stairs. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, until they seemed to echo inside my head. By the time we burst outside, the night air felt sharp and clean, like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. But the relief was short-lived. As we reached the car, I turned to look back at the hospital. Figures stood in the windows, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And at the center, standing just outside the entrance, was the young woman. She raised a hand again, as if waving goodbye, and then she was gone. Jake and I didn't speak on the drive home. We didn't have to. The silence between us was filled with the unspoken understanding that we'd seen something we could never explain, something we could never escape. It's been years since that night, but I can't forget it. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, as if they're calling me back. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that doesn't belong. They say Byberry is haunted, that the spirits of the patients still linger there, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured. I believe it. I saw them. I felt them. And I know that if I ever go back, I might not make it out. If you ever think about visiting, don't. Some places aren't just haunted, they're hungry, and Byberry is starving. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling exploration of haunted asylums. The stories we shared tonight remind us of the thin veil between this world and the next. Do you believe in ghosts? Or could there be another explanation for these eerie encounters? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a dive into the mysterious and macabre. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the past never truly leaves.